Verna Holt buys Larkin Field Farm in the autumn of 1883 for $8, a sum so far below the value of the land itself that the county clerk processing her deed asks her twice whether she understands what she is purchasing before he will stamp the paper, and she tells him twice that she understands the price, which is the only part of the transaction she can claim any real certainty about. She has come to Nebraska territory from Ohio, widowed the previous spring when her husband succumbed to an illness that moved through their small town with a speed that left half the households in mourning by the time it finally burned itself out, and she has spent the intervening months in the particular fog of grief that eventually resolves, for people who cannot afford to remain in it indefinitely, into the practical business of deciding what comes next. What came next for Verna was a distant relative's letter describing an abandoned farm on good prairie ground, available for almost nothing, and she had read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to believe the price was not a misprint. The journey west takes her the better part of 3 weeks, first by train as far as the tracks extend, and then by hired wagon across increasingly open country, the landscape flattening and simplifying the further she travels until the horizon becomes a single unbroken line in every direction, a sight that unsettles her at first and then, gradually, begins to feel like a kind of honesty she has not previously encountered in landscape. Nothing hidden, nothing concealed, simply the whole of the visible world laid out plainly for anyone patient enough to look at it. The farm itself, when she arrives in the thin gold light of an October afternoon, presents itself as good land in every respect she can immediately assess. Flat and fertile, a solid house, a barn in reasonable repair, fences that need work but not replacement. She spends her first weeks in the ordinary labor of settling a new property, learning the particular rhythms of prairie farming from the small handful of neighbors who ride over to introduce themselves. And it is not until she begins walking the full extent of her fields in her second week, assessing what has been planted and what has gone fallow across the years of vacancy, that she notices the field on the property's eastern edge, a full acre, that appears, even in late autumn, with everything else gone brown and dormant, to hold the faint circular outline of something that grew there differently than the surrounding grass, a perfect ring perhaps 40 feet across, visible mostly as a subtle difference in the color and density of the dead vegetation within it compared to what surrounds it. She does not think much of it initially, attributing the pattern to some quirk of drainage or soil composition that might produce uneven growth without requiring any more elaborate explanation. She has more pressing matters to attend to before winter sets in, and the circle, whatever produced it, is not growing anything at present that requires her attention. She forgets about it almost entirely through the cold months that follow, occupied with the considerable work of keeping a household running through a Nebraska winter largely on her own. And it is not until the following spring, watching her fields begin their seasonal transformation from dormant brown to living green, that she remembers the circle and rides out one warm April morning to see what, if anything, it has produced. What she finds stops her in the saddle. The circle is there again, in the exact same location, and as far as she can judge by eye, the exact same diameter as the faint outline she noticed the previous autumn, but now it holds an actual crop of something, a dense ring of plant growth unlike anything else on the property. Dark green stalks, perhaps knee-high, unfamiliar in a way that unsettles her more than she initially expects it to. She has some experience with prairie vegetation from her months on the farm, has learned to recognize the common grasses and the volunteer growth that springs up wherever ground goes untended, And this is none of those things. The stalks are thicker, the leaves a shape she does not recognize from any plant she has encountered before, and they are confined with an evenness that no natural growth pattern she is aware of would produce to the precise circular boundary, the ground marked out the previous autumn. She dismounts and walks the circle's edge carefully, noting how sharply the growth stops. The transition from the dense, unfamiliar plants to the ordinary prairie grass outside the boundary occurring within the space of inches, rather than the gradual blending she would expect from any natural cause. She kneels at several points along the boundary, examining the soil itself for any sign of what might account for such a precise transition, a change in composition, a buried structure, anything at all that might explain the sharpness of the line, and finds nothing beyond ordinary prairie earth on both sides of it, identical in every respect she can determine, except for what chooses or is somehow compelled to grow on one side of the boundary and not the other. She has never planted this field. She has never authorized anyone else to plant it. Nothing in the farm's records, sparse as they are, mentions any cultivation of this particular acre. Whatever is growing here has grown itself in a perfect circle for reasons she cannot begin to explain, and she stands at its edge for a long while in the warm spring air, trying to decide whether the appropriate response is fascination or alarm, and finding, in the end, that it is some uncomfortable combination of both. She notices standing there that the ordinary prairie sounds around her, the wind through the grass, the distant call of birds, seem to quiet somewhat as she approaches the boundary, though she cannot be entirely certain this is not simply her own attention narrowing rather than any actual change in the world around her. She stays at the circle's edge for the better part of an hour that first morning, simply watching it, making no move to cross the boundary or sample the growth, simply letting the experience of being near it settle into something she can examine plainly. The plants within the boundary do not behave strangely in any way beyond their unexplained presence. They do not move against the wind, do not produce any sound she can detect, do not carry any odor she can smell from her position outside the perimeter. They are simply there, dense and green and impossibly precise, occupying a perfect circle of ground that has never been planted, and insisting through their very ordinariness, once she has accepted their impossible existence, that she find a way to simply be neighbors with something she cannot explain. She goes back to the house and starts a ledger. That same afternoon, making her first entry, dated and careful, describing the circle's approximate diameter, the height of the growth, its color and density, the sharpness of the boundary, the silence that seems to attend proximity to it. She does not know yet what she is building toward, whether this ledger will ever explain anything or simply constitute a record that something inexplicable occurred here. She knows only that the practice of writing it down steadies her the way such practices have always steadied her, transforming the formless unease of the unknown into something with dates and margins and the clean, orderly structure of a woman who intends to keep paying attention regardless of what paying attention costs her. Ezra Cole from the Prairie View spread 2 miles south rides over during her third week of noticing the circle, arriving with the particular careful approach she has come to recognize as characteristic of every neighbor who wants to assess a new arrival before offering assistance. He is sun-weathered and light-haired and watches her examine the field for a moment before dismounting, the kind of man who observes before he speaks, and speaks only when he has something worth saying, which Verna, who has encountered too many men of the opposite habit, finds refreshing. When she mentions what she has found, his reaction tells her immediately that this is not news to him. He confirms, when she asks directly, that the circle has appeared every spring for as long as anyone in the county can remember, always in the same field, always the same size, always gone entirely by the first hard frost of autumn, leaving behind only the faint outline she noticed the previous year, which fades over winter until it is barely visible by the following spring, when the whole cycle begins again. He tells her, when she asks whether he has ever seen it up close, that he rode over to the field boundary once, several years earlier, when the property was briefly occupied by a family who lasted only a single season before moving on. He looked at the circle for a long while from outside the boundary and found himself, he says carefully, unwilling to approach any closer, not from any specific fear he could identify, but from a sense that the boundary was there for a reason, that whatever defined the circle's edge defined it for a purpose, and that stepping across it without understanding that purpose would be the kind of action a person might regret without being able to explain precisely why. He has not gone back since. He tells her this without apology, as a simple accounting of his experience, and she respects him for it, for the honesty of admitting that something stopped him without pretending he understood what that something was. He tells her there is a woman in town, Winifred Hale, whose family originally homesteaded this farm decades earlier and who witnessed the circle appear for the first time when she was a girl. He offers to take her there. And Verna, who has by this point moved from idle curiosity to genuine determination to understand what she is dealing with, accepts immediately. They arrange to ride into town together within the week, and in the intervening days Verna rides out to the field each morning and evening, adding observations to her ledger, finding that the routine of daily attention steadies her considerably more than she expected it to, the circle becoming in these days less a source of dread and more a subject of study. The difference between being afraid of something and being interested in it smaller, she discovers, than she had previously assumed. He tells her there is a woman in town, Winifred Hale, whose family originally homesteaded this farm decades earlier, and who witnessed the circle appear for the first time when she was a girl. He offers to take her there, and Verna, who has by this point moved from idle curiosity to genuine determination to understand what she is dealing with, accepts immediately. Winifred Hale proves to be in her 70s, sharp-eyed and precise in her recollections, living in a modest house at the edge of town with the particular contentment of a woman who has settled her accounts with a difficult past and made her peace with it. She receives Verna's questions with the particular readiness of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask them properly. She was 9 years old, she tells Verna, in the spring of 1841, the first year her family worked the land that would become Larkin Field Farm, when the circle first appeared in what had the previous autumn, been an entirely ordinary section of prairie sod her father had just begun breaking for cultivation. He had plowed perhaps half the field the previous fall, intending to finish the work in spring, and when spring came, he found, in the section he had not yet plowed, a circle of dense, unfamiliar growth, exactly where Verna now finds it, already established, already at full height, as though it had grown overnight rather than through any ordinary seasonal process. Her father, a practical man, not given to superstition, assumed some seed had been carried in by wind or bird and simply thrived in that particular patch of ground, and he left it alone that first year, more from being occupied with other work than from any specific caution. The following spring, Winifred continues, the circle appeared again in the same location, though her father had, by then, plowed through the area entirely, turning the soil completely. planting his own crop across the whole field, including the space where the circle had grown. The new growth appeared anyway, in the same location, the same diameter, breaking through whatever he had planted there and displacing it entirely within the circle's boundary, while leaving his crop undisturbed everywhere else. This is when her father began to take the matter seriously, she says, and this is also, she believes, when he began the practice that the family maintained for the following decades of simply leaving that section of the field unplanted and unplowed, allowing the circle its space each spring rather than attempting to interfere with whatever process produced it. Verna asks whether Winifred's family ever attempted to determine what the plants actually were, whether anyone tried to identify the species or understand its origin. Winifred's expression grows more careful at this question. Her father tried in the family's third year on the land, cutting a sample of the growth and carrying it into town to show it to anyone who might recognize it. A traveling botanist, a knowledgeable neighbor, anyone with more expertise than a working farmer typically possesses. Nobody could identify it. Several people who examined the sample described a specific unease in handling it that they could not fully articulate, a wrongness they struggled to put into words beyond the simple observation that it did not resemble anything they had encountered in their considerable experience with prairie and cultivated vegetation alike. Her father stopped trying to identify it after that, she says, and returned to the practice of simply leaving it alone. What Winifred remembers most clearly, and what she tells Verna with the particular weight of a memory she has carried carefully for over 40 years, concerns an incident in her family's 6th year on the farm, when her younger brother, then a boy of perhaps 12 and considerably less cautious than their father, decided to walk into the center of the circle on a dare from a visiting cousin. He crossed the boundary, walked to the circle's center, and stood there for what Winifred remembers as perhaps a full minute before their father, alerted by the commotion, came running and pulled him bodily back across the boundary. The boy himself, questioned afterward about what he experienced standing at the center, could describe only a sensation of profound quiet, an absence of the ordinary prairie wind and insect sound that surrounded the circle everywhere else, as though this space within the boundary existed in a slightly different register of the world than the space outside it. He was not harmed, Winifred says. He simply never went near the circle again for the remainder of his life, and would not discuss the experience further, no matter how the family pressed him. Winifred adds, after a pause, that her brother lived a long, and by all accounts, perfectly ordinary life afterward, married, raised children of his own, and never once, in the decades that followed, offered any further account of what he felt standing at that circle's center, though she remembers, even into his old age, a particular stillness that would come over him whenever the subject was raised in company, the stillness of a man revisiting something he had decided long ago not to revisit further. Verna rides home, turning this over carefully, resolving to approach the circle with considerably more caution than she has shown thus far, while also finding herself, despite the caution, unable to simply leave the matter alone the way Winifred's family apparently managed to for decades. She begins keeping careful observations in a ledger, documenting the circle's growth through the following weeks, its rate of development, any changes in its appearance, comparing her notes against what little pattern she can discern from Winifred's account of decades of prior seasons. The documentation becomes, over the following weeks, one of the most grounding practices of her new life on the prairie. She rides out to the field every 2 or 3 days and spends an hour observing from outside the boundary, recording what she sees, and finds that the circle is in its own quiet way one of the most reliable and consistent presences she has encountered since her husband's death, appearing when it said it would appear behaving as Winifred described, changing through the season at a steady and predictable rate. There is, she admits in one evening ledger entry, something almost comforting about this, about a mystery that keeps its appointments and maintains its patterns with such fidelity in a world where so many things that mattered to her have been unexpectedly taken away. She begins, as the growing season progresses, to develop her own working theory about the circle's nature, not the question of what it is, which she has decided she cannot answer and perhaps was never intended to, but the question of what kind of thing it is, which feels more tractable. Whatever produces the circle is not aggressive. It has coexisted with working ranches on this land for at least 40 years, probably considerably longer, without ever doing anything that could reasonably be described as threatening. The Calloway family worked around it for generations. Winifred's brother walked to its center and returned unchanged, shaken by the experience, but physically unharmed. The circle simply appears each spring, thrives through summer, and vanishes with the first frost, asking nothing of whoever occupies the surrounding land beyond the modest accommodation of being left alone in its 40-foot boundary, which seems, to Verna, an entirely reasonable thing to ask. Cornelius Yates of the Yates Seed and Grain Company arrives during her 6th week. His interest, he explains, rooted in his company's ongoing research into unusual and potentially commercially valuable plant varieties, a subject he raises with a carefully casual air that does not entirely disguise the specific and calculated nature of his true interest. Various rumors about an unusual growth pattern on this property, and he would be very interested in acquiring the land, or at minimum securing rights to study and cultivate whatever grows in that particular field, for a sum he names that considerably exceeds the $8 she paid for the entire property. She declines, both because she has grown genuinely attached to understanding the mystery herself, and because something about his careful, calculated interest strikes her as considerably less benign than simple scientific curiosity would explain. He does not take the refusal well, though his displeasure manifests in the same smooth, patient manner she has come to recognize as characteristic of men who do not consider a single refusal to be conclusive. His men begin appearing at her property line in the weeks that follow, and on 2 occasions she catches evidence of someone having attempted, unsuccessfully, to enter the circle itself under cover of darkness. Footprints in the soft spring soil approaching the boundary, and then curiously stopping well short of actually crossing it, as though whoever attempted the intrusion lost their nerve at the last possible moment. She adds this observation to her ledger alongside everything else, finding it, on reflection, more reassuring than alarming evidence that whatever protects this circle's boundary operates with some consistency regardless of who approaches it, friend or trespasser alike. The more direct interference, when it comes, targets her cattle and her fences rather than the circle itself, and she documents this pattern with the same careful precision she has been applying to everything else on the property. Riders at night. A gate left deliberately unlatched. 2 fence rails found deliberately damaged, in a manner no weather or animal would produce. She notices, in the course of this documentation, that Yates's men, whoever they are and however emboldened they become in their various harassments, never once approach the eastern field. They cut her northern fences, they leave the western gate unlatched, they spook her cattle near the barn, but they give the 40-foot circle in the eastern field a wide, deliberate berth, as though Yates himself has warned them away from it, or they have made their own private decision to leave it entirely alone. She finds this, in its own quiet way, telling. Whatever the circle represents, it commands a kind of respect even from the men being paid to disregard everything else she considers her own. she catches one of Yates's hands directly on her property in her 7th week, a man attempting to cut a section of fence near her cattle pen. And though he flees before she can identify him with certainty, he leaves behind a tool stamped clearly with the mark of the Yates Seed and Grain Company's equipment depot, evidence concrete enough that even a sympathetic judge could not easily dismiss it. The weeks following the verdict are the first weeks since her arrival that Verna can devote her full attention to the farm itself and to the circle specifically, without dividing it between the legitimate and illegitimate pressures on her time. Ezra stays close, as he has to all of it, and the staying has become, in these quieter weeks, something she no longer thinks of in terms of necessity. She takes him out to the circle's edge. One warm evening in late summer, the growth at its full dense height, and the prairie gold and soft around it, and they sit together in the grass at a respectful distance from the boundary, watching the light change over the unfamiliar plants until the sun gets low and the color shifts, and the circle looks, in that particular angle of light, almost luminous against the surrounding field. She does not feel afraid sitting there. She has not felt afraid, she realizes. For some weeks now, she has felt curious and attentive, and occasionally moved in a way she cannot precisely name, but not afraid. She writes this when they return to the house in her ledger, dated and deliberate, as what it is, a final entry in the fear portion of her record of this place, replaced now by something she intends to keep paying attention to for a much longer time. She rides to Ezra with the tool, and together they bring the matter to the county deputy, who proves receptive given that Yates's company has apparently pressured at least 2 other local landowners in similar fashion over recent years, each of them similarly reluctant to sell land that his surveys had identified as containing something of unusual botanical or commercial interest. The resulting investigation and subsequent trial resolve in her favor. Yates fined substantially and warned formally against further attempts to acquire her property through pressure rather than negotiation, though he tells her on his way out of the courthouse that he remains convinced whatever grows in that field represents something of genuine value that she is, in his estimation, squandering through simple stubbornness. She does not attempt to correct this impression, finding it easier to let him believe what he wishes than to explain a perspective she is not certain she has fully worked out herself. The circle continues its pattern through the following seasons, exactly as Winifred described, appearing each spring, thriving through the growing months, vanishing entirely with the first hard frost, leaving behind only the faint outline that fades slowly through winter before the cycle resumes. Verna develops, over these repeated observations, her own careful theory about its nature, recorded thoughtfully in her ledger alongside everything else she has documented. She has come to believe, watching the pattern repeat with such remarkable consistency, that the circle represents something considerable older than her farm or Winifred's family's original homestead, something that predates any human cultivation of this particular acre and simply continues year after year, according to whatever cycle governs it, entirely independent of who owns the surrounding land or what they choose to do with it. She spends one full growing season conducting careful measurements, the exact diameter recorded at weekly intervals, the height of the growth tracked against the calendar, the precise date of first emergence and final dieback noted with the same rigor she has applied to every other observation, and finds, at the season's end, that the pattern holds with a consistency that borders on the mechanical, the same 40-foot diameter, within a margin of inches, the same growth rate, the same late-season dieback arriving within a day or 2 of the previous year's timing, regardless of that particular season's weather, This mechanical consistency troubles her more, in some ways, than any wilder or more erratic behavior might have. The sense that she is observing something operating according to a schedule rather than a season. A distinction she finds herself unable to fully articulate even in her own private ledger, but which she nonetheless feels with some certainty to be true. She writes to Winifred in the early autumn a long letter describing her year of observation and the measurements she has accumulated, asking whether the timing of the circle's appearance and disappearance aligns with the dates Winifred remembers from the Calloway family's decades of coexistence with it. Winifred's reply, arriving several weeks later, confirms that the pattern has indeed held consistent across the family's entire occupancy, the circle appearing each year within the same narrow window and vanishing each autumn at very nearly the same date, reliable enough that her grandfather eventually stopped being surprised by it, and simply noted each emergence and disappearance in his own farm journal as he might note the first frost or the last reliable rain, a regular event whose predictability had, by the end of his life, entirely replaced whatever unease he had initially felt about it. The letter from Winifred also includes a small detail Verna had not asked about and did not know to ask, something Winifred mentions almost as an afterthought at the letter's close, that her grandfather's farm journal described the circle in its final years as looking somehow slightly larger than it had in his first years of observation, though the change was so gradual and so small that he was never certain whether the circle was genuinely growing or whether his memory of the early years was simply less precise than his later careful measurements. He had not been alarmed by this, the journal entry suggested, only curious, noting it as another datum in the long record he had been quietly keeping and wondering, with the equanimity of a man who has lived alongside something inexplicable long enough to accept it without resolution, what 40 more years might show if anyone cared to keep watching. Verna measures the diameter carefully. One more time after reading this, recording the result in her own ledger, and makes a note to measure again at the end of each subsequent season. Adding her own chapter to a record she has come to understand stretches back considerably further than she previously imagined. She has stopped trying to determine what the plants themselves are, following Winifred's father's example, and has instead focused her attention on simply observing and documenting the pattern as faithfully as she can, treating it as a permanent and largely benign feature of the land she has chosen to make her own. In the same spirit she might document the seasonal behavior of the local wildlife or the annual flooding pattern of a nearby creek. The winter that follows is long in the way that Nebraska winters are long, the prairie flattened under snow, and the circle's location marked only by its now familiar faint outline in the frozen ground, the growth entirely gone until spring restores it. Verna spends the winter evenings rereading her ledger from cover to cover, adding marginal notes and observations that the passage of months has made possible, connections between entries she did not notice when she first wrote them. She sends another letter to Winifred, enclosing copies of her most careful measurements, and receives in return a reply that includes, carefully wrapped in oilskin, several pages from her grandfather's own farm journal. The entries concerning the circle given to Verna, Winifred writes, because she is the first person in living memory to ask for them and to have demonstrated through an entire season of careful watching that she deserves to have them. She reads the old journal pages by lamplight, her grandfather's careful hand describing encounters with the circle across 3 decades, and finds running through all of them a quality she recognizes from her own entries, not fear, which was there in the early years and faded, but a kind of stubborn, patient attention that seems, in retrospect, to have been its own form of answer to whatever question the circle posed, simply by being there. The old man never found an explanation. He never once wrote that. He understood what the circle was, or why it grew where it grew, or what it intended by appearing each spring and vanishing each autumn for 30 years. But in his final entries, written in a hand beginning to tremble with age, there is a quality of settled peace that Verna finds she recognizes without having expected to. The peace of someone who has made a full and honest accounting of a mystery and decided that the accounting itself was the point, not the answer. Ezra asks her to marry him on a clear evening in late summer. The fields circle at full growth in the near distance, dense and green against the surrounding gold prairie grass, and she says yes with the particular ease of a woman who has, over the past year, grown comfortable enough with genuine mystery that the ordinary uncertainty of a new marriage holds little additional weight by comparison. He has, over the months of their acquaintance, become as familiar with her observations and her careful ledger as she is herself, riding out with her on quiet evenings to simply sit at the circle's edge together, watching the light change over the unfamiliar dense growth, neither of them needing to speak much during these visits, both content with the particular companionship of shared attention to something neither of them fully understands. They marry the following spring at the farm, timing the ceremony at Verna's quiet insistence for a week when the circle has just begun its annual growth, its presence a fixture of the property she has come to think of as simply part of what makes this land specifically hers rather than any interchangeable acre of Nebraska prairie. Winifred Hale makes the journey for the wedding which Verna did not expect and which moves her considerably more than she anticipated. The old woman traveling the distance simply to see, she says when she arrives, that the farm has finally found an occupant who intends to stay in it and means the staying as genuinely as any homesteader in the family's long history ever did. The ceremony itself is a modest affair, a small gathering of neighbors and the deputy and Winifred seated in the yard among the cottonwoods, the circle visible in its young spring growth in the distant field, no taller than her knee yet, but clearly established, the year's growth already confirming itself right on schedule. Verna watches it from where she stands exchanging vows and thinks, not for the first time, that the circle is in some sense the most reliable occupant this farm has ever had, more dependable than any family, more consistent than any weather, more faithful to its own pattern than anything else in her experience of this particular stretch of Nebraska ground. On the morning after the wedding, Verna walks out to the field alone before Ezra wakes and stands at the circle's edge in the early gold light, watching the dense, unfamiliar growth stir slightly in the morning breeze, exactly as it has every spring since her arrival, exactly as it apparently has since 1841, and likely for a considerable span of years before that as well. She does not enter the circle. She has never entered it, respecting the caution that Winifred's family maintained across decades, and that she has come to share fully through her own year of careful observation. She simply stands at its edge, as she often does on quiet mornings, feeling the particular stillness that seems to emanate from within the boundary even at this distance, and she thinks, as she often thinks in these moments, that whatever this circle represents, it has asked nothing of her beyond her attention and her respect, and she has found, over the past year, that she is entirely willing to continue providing both for as long as she remains the person responsible for this particular piece of ground. She opens her ledger, which she has brought with her out of habit now, more than deliberate intention, and adds the morning's date and a single line of observation. The circle at second week growth, exactly as expected, A record that will join all the others in the growing body of documentation she intends to keep faithfully for as long as she lives here, passing it on eventually, she thinks, to whoever comes after her, so that they too may have the gift of knowing from the start that what grows in this field is not to be feared, only watched and respected, and left, carefully and willingly, alone.